Amelia Lawson stared at the pregnancy test in disbelief. 3 tests, all positive. Her hands were shaking as she sat down on the edge of her bathtub. This was impossible. She had never been intimate with anyone. At 32 years old, she had devoted her life to her nursing career at Blackwood Medical Center, one of the most prestigious private hospitals in New York. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself, running her fingers through her auburn hair. The morning sickness that had plagued her for the past 2 weeks suddenly made terrible sense. But how? She was a virgin, for heaven's sake. The sound of her phone ringing snapped her out of her thoughts. It was Hannah, the head nurse, probably wondering why she wasn't at work yet. "Amelia, where are you? Mr. Blackwood has been asking for you specifically for his morning checkup. Ethan Blackwood." Just thinking about her boss made her stomach do flips. He was everywhere in the news these days. The billionaire who had built an empire from nothing only to end up in a wheelchair. After a terrible car accident last year. The accident that had also left him unable to father children. "I'll be right there," Amelia said, quickly splashing water on her face. She couldn't deal with this pregnancy mystery now. She had patients who needed her. When she arrived at the hospital, the usual buzz of activity filled the halls. But today everything felt different. As she walked past the expensive artwork that lined the corridors of the private wing, she felt like she was in a dream. "There you are," Hannah rushed toward her. "Mr. Blackwood has been impossible all morning. You know how he only trusts you for his physical therapy sessions." Amelia nodded, trying to push aside her personal crisis. She had been working with Ethan Blackwood for the past 8 months, ever since his accident. Despite his reputation for being cold and demanding, she had seen a different side of him during their sessions. As she entered his private suite, Ethan was sitting in his wheelchair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. Even confined to a wheelchair, he commanded attention. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive suit was immaculate. "You're late," he said without turning around. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. It won't happen again." He finally turned to face her, his steel-gray eyes studying her carefully. "You look pale. Are you ill?" "I'm fine," she lied, setting up the equipment for his therapy session. "Shall we begin?" As she helped him with his exercises, her mind kept wandering to the positive pregnancy tests hidden in her purse. She was so distracted that she almost dropped his leg during a stretch. "Something's wrong," Ethan said firmly. It wasn't a question. "In 8 months, you've never been this unfocused. Tell me what's bothering you." Amelia felt tears welling up in her eyes. I don't understand it myself." "Try me." His voice was softer now, almost gentle. Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "I'm pregnant. But it's impossible. I haven't." Ethan's face hardened. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Amelia nodded, wiping away a tear. "I'm a virgin, Mr. Blackwood. I've never been with anyone. But somehow, I'm pregnant. 3 tests confirmed it this morning." She expected him to laugh, to call her crazy, or maybe even fire her on the spot. Instead, he wheeled himself closer to her, his expression intense. "Get your coat," he said suddenly. "What? Why?" "Because we're going to find out exactly what's going on. I'm taking you to see Dr. Morrison right now. She's the best fertility specialist in the country. But your therapy session, this is more important." He was already pressing the intercom button. "James, bring the car around. We're going to the Madison Clinic." As Amelia gathered her things, still in a daze, she didn't notice the shadow that passed across Ethan's face. She didn't see the way his hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests until his knuckles turned white. And she certainly didn't hear him whisper under his breath, "It's happening again." The drive to Madison Clinic was silent. Amelia sat next to Ethan in his luxury car, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. She couldn't help but notice how he kept glancing at her, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Blackwood," she finally said, "you don't have to do this. This is my problem to sort out." "No," he said firmly. "Something tells me this is bigger than both of us." Dr. Sarah Morrison's office at Madison Clinic screamed money and success. But right now, she was staring at her computer screen with a puzzled look that made Amelia's heart race. "This is unusual," Dr. Morrison said, adjusting her designer glasses. "I've run the tests 3 times now. There's no doubt that you're pregnant, Amelia. And according to these results, you're carrying triplets." Amelia felt the room spin. "Triplets? Yes, and they're developing perfectly, but that's not the most surprising part." Dr. Morrison looked at Ethan, who sat rigid in his wheelchair. "Mr. Blackwood, would you mind if I speak freely about your medical history?" "Go ahead," he said through clenched teeth. "After your accident last year, the trauma left you unable to father children. We all know this, but the DNA test we just ran..." Dr. Morrison paused, taking a deep breath. "The babies Amelia is carrying are yours, Mr. Blackwood, all 3 of them." The silence in the room was deafening. Amelia felt like she might faint. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Mr. Blackwood and I have never... We wouldn't... I believe you," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "which makes this situation even more concerning. Someone has done something highly unethical and illegal here." Ethan's face had turned to stone. "Victoria," he said, almost to himself. "Your ex-wife?" Amelia asked, remembering the gossip she'd heard around the hospital. "She worked here at Madison Clinic before we divorced," Ethan explained, his voice tight with anger. "She was a fertility specialist working on experimental treatments, but she lost her license last year after some patients reported unethical practices." Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. "Victoria was brilliant, but she crossed lines. She was obsessed with pushing the boundaries of fertility treatment. We fired her when we discovered she was conducting unauthorized experiments." Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold. "Are you saying she somehow used Mr. Blackwood's genetic material without permission? And yours too, apparently," Ethan said softly. "The question is, how did she get access to either of us?" A memory suddenly hit Amelia. "The annual employee health screening 3 months ago, they took blood samples from all of us. And I had my last fertility assessment here around the same time," Ethan added, his expression darkening. "Right before Victoria lost her license, Dr. Morrison was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling hospital security. We need to check the lab records from that period. And Mr. Blackwood, I strongly suggest you contact your lawyer." But Ethan was watching Amelia, who had gone very pale. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I just found out I'm carrying triplets that were created without my knowledge or consent, and they belong to my boss, who I've never..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan wheeled himself closer to her chair. "We're going to figure this out, Amelia, I promise you that. Victoria won't get away with this." "But what about the babies?" Amelia's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "They're innocent in all this." Something softened in Ethan's eyes. "They're my children too, even if this isn't how I ever imagined having them. Whatever happens, I'll make sure all 4 of you are taken care of." Dr. Morrison hung up her phone. "Security is reviewing the records now, but there's something else you both need to know. These babies, the genetic manipulation Victoria must have used, it's experimental. We'll need to monitor this pregnancy very carefully." "What are you saying?" Ethan demanded. "I'm saying that this pregnancy could be risky for both Amelia and the babies." Dr. Morrison looked at them seriously. "You'll need to make some decisions, and quickly. Amelia will need constant medical supervision. And Mr. Blackwood, given that these are legally your children, you'll need to be involved in these decisions." Amelia felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Just yesterday, her biggest worry had been paying her student loans. Now she was carrying her boss's genetically engineered triplets. "I can't go back to my apartment," she realized suddenly. "The building doesn't even have an elevator, and I can barely afford the rent as it is. How am I supposed to..." "You'll move in with me," Ethan said firmly. Both women stared at him. "I have a fully accessible penthouse," he continued. "There's plenty of space, and I already have medical staff on call 24/7 because of my condition. It's the most logical solution." "Mr. Blackwood, I couldn't possibly..." "Ethan," he interrupted. "Under the circumstances, I think you should call me Ethan. And this isn't up for discussion. These are my children too, and I protect what's mine." The way he said it sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. She looked at this man she'd known only professionally for 8 months, the man who was now inextricably linked to her future, and saw something new in his eyes. Determination, yes, but also something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "We should go," he said, checking his phone. "My lawyer will meet us at my penthouse in an hour. Dr. Morrison, I trust you'll keep this situation confidential for now." "Of course, but you should know. News like this has a way of getting out, and when it does, it'll be the scandal of the year," Ethan finished grimly. "A virgin nurse pregnant with her billionaire boss's triplets. The tabloids will have a field day." Amelia felt sick again, but not from morning sickness this time. "What are we going to do?" Ethan reached over and took her hand, surprising them both. "We are going to protect our children, and then we're going to make Victoria pay for playing God with our lives." His hand was warm and strong around hers, and despite everything, Amelia felt a little less afraid. As they left the clinic, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a darkened window above, or the satisfied smile that played across Victoria Blackwood's perfect features as she watched them go. Ethan's penthouse took up the entire top floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings. As James, his driver, helped him out of the car and into his wheelchair, Amelia stood frozen, staring up at the gleaming tower. "Having second thoughts?" Ethan asked, noticing her hesitation. "This is just a lot to take in," she admitted. "Yesterday, I was just your nurse. Now I'm moving in with you because I'm somehow pregnant with your triplets." The private elevator ride to the penthouse was silent. When the doors opened, Amelia gasped. The space was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of Central Park. Everything was designed for wheelchair accessibility, but it was done so elegantly that it looked like pure luxury. "Mrs. Garcia," Ethan called out. A warm-looking woman in her 60s appeared from what must have been the kitchen. "This is Amelia. She'll be staying with us indefinitely. Please prepare the main guest suite." Mrs. Garcia's eyes widened slightly, but she simply nodded. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Would you and the young lady like some tea while you wait for your lawyer?" Before either could answer, the elevator chimed again. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. "David," Ethan greeted him. "Thank you for coming so quickly." David Matthews had been the Blackwood family lawyer for 20 years. He took in the scene, Ethan in his wheelchair, Amelia standing uncertainly nearby, and his expression gave nothing away. "Perhaps we should sit down," he suggested. "This sounds like a complicated situation." They gathered in Ethan's home office. As Ethan explained everything, David took careful notes, his frown deepening. "This is unprecedented," he said finally. "Victoria could face serious criminal charges for this, but proving it won't be easy. And in the meantime," he looked at Amelia, "the press will have a field day when this gets out. A nurse claiming she's pregnant with her billionaire boss's babies through some sort of medical misconduct? They'll tear you apart." "We need to control the narrative," Ethan said firmly. "Get ahead of the story." "What are you suggesting?" Amelia asked nervously. "Marriage," David said simply. "It's the cleanest solution. You get married quickly, quietly. When the pregnancy becomes public, you're already husband and wife. It's still scandalous, but much more manageable." "No," Amelia said firmly, standing. "Pilis, I won't be forced into a marriage just to protect Mr. Blackwood's reputation. This isn't just about my reputation," Ethan argued. "Think about the children. They deserve to be born into a stable situation, not in the middle of a media circus." "And what about what I deserve?" Amelia's voice cracked. "I didn't ask for any of this." The room fell. Silent. Mrs. Garcia appeared with a tea tray, took one look at the tension in the room and quietly disappeared again. "There might be another way," David said slowly. "We announced that you two have been secretly dating for months. That the pregnancy, while unexpected, is a blessing. We paint Victoria as a disturbed woman, making false accusations because she's bitter about her divorce." "You want me to lie?" Amelia asked. "I want to protect you," Ethan said softly. "All of you." His hand moved unconsciously toward her stomach. Before anyone could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed. His face darkened as he read the message. "It's starting," he said grimly, holding up his phone. On the screen was a tweet from a popular gossip site. "Breaking sources claim billionaire Ethan Blackwood involved in medical scandal at prestigious clinic. Story developing? We need to move fast," David said, already pulling out his phone. "I'll draft a statement." "No," Ethan interrupted. He was looking at Amelia, who had gone pale again. "First, we need to make sure Amelia is okay with whatever we decide. These are her children too." Amelia felt tears welling up in her eyes. Despite everything, despite the crazy situation they were in, Ethan was putting her feelings first. "I need some air," she whispered, heading for the balcony. Santi's evening air was cool on her face as she leaned against the railing, looking out over the city. Behind her, she heard the soft whir of Ethan's wheelchair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know this isn't fair to you." "None of this is fair to either of us," she replied, not turning around. "Your ex-wife played God with our lives, and now we're supposed to just, pretend to be in love, get married, play happy family? Would it be so terrible?" His voice was closer now. "Being married to me?" Amelia finally turned to look at him. In the fading light, with the city glowing behind him, he looked different. Not like her intimidating boss anymore, but like a man, a wounded, complicated man who was trying to do the right thing. "I barely know you," she whispered. "Then get to know me," he said simply. "We have time. The babies won't be here for months. Let's take it day by day." Before she could respond, her phone chimed, then his. Then they heard David cursing from inside the office. Victoria had just posted on social media the truth about Ethan Blackwood's miracle babies and the nurse who's carrying them. Full story tomorrow morning. Ethan reached for Amelia's hand. This time she didn't pull away. "Whatever happens," he said firmly, "we face it together. Not because we have to, but because those babies deserve parents who can at least try to be friends." Amelia looked at their joined hands, feeling the strength in his grip. "Friends," she repeated softly. But even as she said it, she wondered if friendship would be enough to weather the storm that was coming. Inside the office, David was already making calls, trying to contain the damage. Mrs. Garcia was stress-baking in the kitchen, the smell of cookies filling the air. And somewhere in the city, Victoria Blackwood was preparing to turn their world upside down even more than she already had. But out there on the balcony, just for a moment, Amelia felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this mess together. Victoria Blackwood's story hit the morning news like a bomb. Every major network was running with it. Amelia woke up in her new room at Ethan's penthouse to find her phone exploding, with messages and missed calls. "Don't look at the news," Mrs. Garcia said, bringing her breakfast in bed. "Mr. Blackwood's orders. He wants you to eat something first." But Amelia couldn't help herself. She turned on the TV just as a perfectly polished Victoria was speaking to reporters outside Madison Clinic. "As a medical professional, I couldn't stay silent," Victoria was saying, her voice dripping with fake concern. "What's happening at Madison Clinic is criminal. My ex-husband's nurse is carrying triplets created through unauthorized genetic manipulation. The public deserves to know the truth." Amelia felt sick, and it wasn't just morning sickness. The way Victoria was twisting everything, making it sound like Amelia was somehow involved in the scheme. The bedroom door opened, and Ethan wheeled himself in. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. "I told Mrs. Garcia to keep you away from the news," he said, frowning at the TV. "She's making me look like a criminal," Amelia whispered. "Like I helped her do this to us." Ethan grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. "We're fighting back. David's arranged a press conference for this afternoon, but first, he pulled out a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Ethan, no. Just listen," he said quietly. "I know we agreed to take things slow, to try being friends first, but Victoria's changed the game. If we announce our engagement now, it takes the wind out of her sails, makes her look like a bitter ex-wife trying to ruin our happiness." "But it's not real," Amelia protested weakly. "It could be." His voice was soft, but intense. "I've spent the whole night thinking about this, Amelia. About you. About how you've been the only person in my life who's treated me exactly the same before and after my accident. About how you make me laugh during our therapy sessions, even on my worst days." Amelia's heart was pounding. "You're just saying this because of the situation?" "No, I'm saying it because it's true. Because maybe Victoria did us a favor without meaning to." Maybe she gave us a chance at something real. He opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me right now. I'm asking you to give us a chance, to let me take care of you and our children, to see if maybe, just maybe, we could build something real from this crazy situation. Before Amelia could respond, Mrs. Garcia burst into the room. Mr. Blackwood, you need to see this. She was holding her tablet. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Explosive new allegations in Blackwood medical scandal. Former clinic employee claims nurse Amelia Lawson was paid millions to participate in illegal fertility experiment. That's a lie, Amelia cried. Out, tears streaming down her face. I would never— I know, Ethan said firmly. He wheeled closer to her bed, taking her hand. Everyone who knows you knows that's a lie. But now you see what we're up against. Victoria won't stop until she's destroyed both of us. Amelia looked at the ring, still glittering in its box, then at Ethan's face, so full of determination, and something else she was afraid to name. If we do this, she said slowly, we do it right. No more lies. We tell the truth about Victoria, about what she did to us, and we face whatever comes together. Ethan's face broke into a genuine smile. Together, he agreed. She held out her left hand, trembling slightly. As Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, Mrs. Garcia wiped away a tear. It's a perfect fit, Ethan said softly. The ring or us? Amelia asked, trying to joke through her own tears. Both, maybe. The moment was broken by the sound of Ethan's phone. It was David. Turn on Channel 7 now, the lawyer said without preamble. Mrs. Garcia grabbed the remote. On the screen was Victoria again, but this time she wasn't alone. Standing next to her was Thomas Reynolds, Ethan's former business partner and biggest rival. Mr. Reynolds has agreed to fund a full investigation into the unethical practices at Madison Clinic, Victoria announced, smiling triumphantly, including Mr. Blackwood's involvement in these experimental procedures. She's working with Reynolds? Mrs. Garcia gasped. But he's been trying to take over Blackwood Industries for years. Ethan's face had gone hard as stone. This was never just about the babies, he realized. Victoria's trying to destroy everything I've built, and she's using you to do it. Amelia looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, then back at Victoria's smirking face on the TV. Something shifted inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the 3 innocent lives she was carrying, about the man beside her who was fighting his own battles, about truth and justice and standing up to bullies who thought they could play with people's lives. When's the press conference? She asked, her voice stronger than she felt. 2 hours, Ethan replied. Are you sure you're up for this? Amelia squared her shoulders. I'm about to become Mrs. Blackwood, aren't I? It's time I started acting like it. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she saw real pride in Ethan's eyes. And maybe, just maybe, something that looked a lot like love. But as Mrs. Garcia helped her get ready for the press conference, neither of them knew that Victoria had one more bomb to drop. One that would shake their newfound alliance to its core. The press conference was about to start. Cameras flashed as Ethan wheeled himself onto the small stage set up in the Blackwood Industries conference room, with Amelia walking beside him. She wore a simple blue dress that made her look both professional and approachable, the engagement ring catching the light. Thank you all for coming, Ethan began, his voice steady. We're here to address the allegations made by my ex-wife, Victoria Blackwood. Before he could continue, the doors burst open. Victoria walked in, Thomas Reynolds right behind her. The reporters went wild, cameras clicking frantically. I'm so sorry to interrupt, Victoria said sweetly, but I thought everyone should see this before we go any further. She held up a USB drive. Security footage from Madison Clinic showing exactly how this little scheme came together. David jumped up from his seat. This press conference is private property, security. But Victoria was already plugging the drive into the presentation system. The large screen behind Ethan and Amelia flickered to life. The footage showed a hospital. Corridor date stamped 3 months ago. Amelia watched in horror as she saw herself on screen, walking into a treatment room. But something was wrong. The Amelia in the video was checking her phone, not paying attention as a nurse, one Amelia had never seen before, prepared an injection. "Stop this," Ethan demanded. "That footage is stolen property." "The public has a right to know, Thomas," Reynolds said smoothly. "How your nurse here agreed to be part of an experimental procedure. For a very generous payment, I might add." Amelia stood up, her hands shaking. "That's not what happened. I never agreed to anything. I don't even remember that day." And suddenly, it hit her. She turned to face Victoria, who was still wearing that smug smile. "You drugged me," Amelia said, her voice getting stronger, "during my employee health screening. That's why I felt so dizzy afterward. That's why I don't remember anything clearly from that day." The reporters were scribbling frantically. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "And I can prove it," Amelia continued, "because I have a severe allergy to latex. It's in all my medical records. That nurse in the video isn't wearing special gloves. If she had really treated me, I would have had a reaction." The room went silent. Victoria's face turned pale. "Furthermore," Ethan added, "every treatment room at Madison Clinic has 2 security cameras, not 1. Where's the footage from the second camera, Victoria? The one that would show what really happened that day?" Thomas Reynolds was already backing toward the door. "I had no knowledge of any illegal activities." "Oh, but you did," came a new voice. Dr. Morrison walked in, flanked by 2 police officers. "We found the emails, Victoria. The ones where you promised Mr. Reynolds inside information about Blackwood Industries in exchange for his help discrediting Ethan and Amelia." "You don't understand," Victoria said, her composure cracking. "He threw me away. After years of marriage, after I spent my whole career trying to give him children, he just divorced me because I couldn't handle his disability. Because I couldn't be his nurse like precious Amelia. I divorced you because you couldn't handle not being in control," Ethan said quietly. "Because you saw my accident as a way to make me dependent on you forever. And when I refused, you decided to punish me by using my own genetic material to create children I could never have on my own. But you made one mistake," Amelia added, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "You chose me as your victim, someone who spends every day caring for others, who would never reject these babies no matter how they were conceived. And you gave these children to a man who, despite everything you did to him, still has more love and integrity in his heart than you ever will." The officers were moving forward now. Victoria looked around wildly, then grabbed her purse and pulled out a small revolver. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters dove under tables. Security rushed forward, but Amelia was faster. She stepped in front of Ethan's wheelchair, shielding him with her body. "Go ahead," she said to Victoria, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Show everyone who you really are." Victoria's hand shook. The gun wavered. And then, finally, she crumpled to the floor, sobbing as the officers handcuffed her. As they led Victoria away, Amelia's legs gave out. Ethan caught her, pulling her onto his lap in the wheelchair. "Are you crazy?" he whispered fiercely into her hair. "She could have shot you, shot our babies." "I knew she wouldn't," Amelia said, though her whole body was trembling. "She needs an audience too much. Shooting us would have ruined her story." The reporters were emerging from under the tables, cameras already rolling again. David was trying to restore order while Dr. Morrison spoke quietly with the police. "Mr. Blackwood," one reporter called out, "is it true that you and Miss Lawson are engaged?" Ethan looked at Amelia, still cradled in his lap. In that moment, with the adrenaline fading and the truth finally out, something shifted between them. "Yes," he said, but he was looking only at her. "Yes, we are." "And the babies?" another reporter asked. "Will you be keeping them?" "They're our children," Amelia said firmly. "However they came to be, they're ours, and we're going to give them all the love that their biological parents should have had for each other." The room grew quiet as Ethan reached up and, for the first time, kissed her right there in front of everyone. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, the kiss didn't feel like part of an act. But in a jail cell across town, Victoria Blackwood was making one last phone call. And the secret she was about to reveal would test Ethan and Amelia's newfound love in ways they could never imagine. The days following Victoria's arrest were a whirlwind. Every newspaper in the country carried the story. Pregnant nurse saves billionaire from crazed ex-wife. The public had fallen in love with Amelia's bravery and Ethan's devotion. Their kiss at the press conference had become the most shared photo on social media, but behind closed doors things were more complicated. "You need to rest," Ethan insisted, watching Amelia pace around his penthouse living room. "Dr. Morrison said stress isn't good for the babies." "How can I rest?" Amelia asked, rubbing her growing belly. She was showing earlier than expected with the triplets. "Victoria's preliminary hearing is tomorrow, and our lawyer still hasn't called with the strategy." The elevator chimed, and Mrs. Garcia hurried in with a worried look on her face. "Mr. Blackwood, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your mother." Ethan went rigid in his wheelchair. "That's impossible. My mother died when I was 10, but the woman who stepped out of the elevator proved him wrong. Elizabeth Blackwood was elegant in her 60s, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer outfit immaculate. She looked exactly like the photos Ethan kept hidden in his desk drawer. "Hello, darling," she said softly. "It's been a long time." Amelia watched as all color drained from Ethan's face. "You're dead," he whispered. "Dad told me you died in a car accident. We buried you. Your father told you what he wanted you to believe." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Just like he told everyone I'd abandoned you, when really, he had me committed to a private mental hospital. For 25 years I've been trying to prove I was sane, trying to find a way back to you. And you choose now to show up." Ethan's voice was hard with anger. "After all these years?" "Because of her." Elizabeth pointed at Victoria's face, on the muted TV screen, where they were replaying footage from the press conference. "She found me 6 months ago. She promised to help me get released if I gave her access to your father's old medical records." "Medical records?" Amelia asked, stepping closer to Ethan instinctively. "About the genetic condition that runs in the Blackwood family," Elizabeth explained. "The one that caused your father's early death. The one that Victoria used to create those babies." The room went silent. Ethan grabbed Amelia's hand so hard it hurt. "What genetic condition?" he demanded. "A rare heart defect. It only affects male children. Your father had it. You have a mild version of it. And now..." Elizabeth looked at Amelia's stomach with concern. "The triplets," Amelia whispered, feeling faint. "If they're boys..." "That's why Victoria did this," Elizabeth continued. "She's trying to prove that Ethan knowingly passed on a dangerous genetic condition. She's going to use it to claim that he was the one behind the illegal experiment, trying to create children despite knowing the risks." Mrs. Garcia quickly brought a chair for Amelia, who sank into it, her head spinning. But Ethan didn't know. He couldn't have known if his father hid everything. "It doesn't matter," David said, stepping out of Ethan's home office where he'd been listening. "Victoria will twist it. She'll claim that as a medical professional, she had an ethical obligation to expose this genetic risk. It could help her defense. She's not going to win," Ethan said firmly, but Amelia could hear the fear in his voice. "We'll fight this." "There's more," Elizabeth said quietly. "Your father, he didn't die from the heart condition. He killed himself when he found out Victoria was investigating the family history. He left a letter explaining everything, but Victoria found it first. That's what she was holding over my head, threatening to expose the truth about your father's death if I didn't help her." Ethan looked like he'd been punched. 2 decades of believing his mother abandoned him, of idolizing his father's memory, all crumbling in minutes. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking. "All of you. I need a moment." Everyone started to leave, but Amelia stayed put. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "Amelia, please, no." Her voice was gentle but firm. "You've been my rock through this whole nightmare. Now it's my turn. We face everything together, remember?" As soon as they were alone, Ethan broke down. All the pain, all the betrayal, came pouring out as Amelia held him. She stroked his hair, letting him cry against her shoulder. "What if she's right?" he finally asked, his voice raw. "What if I've cursed our children with this condition?" "Then we'll handle it," Amelia said, firmly. "Modern medicine has come a long way. If our boys have the condition, we'll get them the best care. They'll have 2 parents who love them unconditionally." Ethan pulled back to look at her, his eyes red but intense. When did you start saying our? Not the babies or these children, but our children. Amelia hadn't even noticed the change. I guess seems somewhere between you taking a bullet for me and me falling in love with you. They both froze as the words hung in the air. You don't have to say that, Ethan said quietly. The engagement, the show for the press. I'm not saying it for them. Amelia took his face in her hands. I'm saying it because it's true. Because somewhere in this crazy mess, between your strength and your kindness and the way you look at me like I'm the most precious thing in your world, I fell in love with you, Ethan Blackwood. He pulled her onto his lap again. But this time, there were no cameras, no reporters, just them and the truth of their feelings. I love you too, he whispered against her lips. God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me. Outside the penthouse windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan. In a few hours, they would have to face Victoria's hearing, deal with Elizabeth's revelations, worry about the baby's health. But for now, they held each other, finding strength in a love that had grown real despite beginning as a lie. Neither of them noticed Elizabeth watching from the doorway, a sad smile on her face, nor did they see her slip a worn envelope from her purse, the real suicide note from Ethan's father, with one last secret that could change everything again. Victoria's preliminary hearing was set to begin in an hour, but all eyes were on the morning news. Elizabeth Blackwood's return from the dead had leaked to the press and the headlines were brutal. Blackwood family secrets exposed, murder, madness, and medical manipulation. Turn it off, Amelia said, watching Ethan's jaw clench as he stared. At the TV. They were in his private office at Blackwood Industries, preparing for the hearing. I should have known, he said quietly, all those years thinking my mother abandoned us while my father was the real monster. Before Amelia could respond, David burst into the office. We have a problem. Victoria's lawyer just submitted new evidence. Medical records from the mental hospital where Elizabeth was kept. What kind of records? Ethan demanded. According to these documents, the genetic heart condition in your family isn't the only hereditary issue. There's also a history of mental illness. Victoria's claiming she created the embryos as part of a legitimate medical study on genetic inheritance. Patterns. Amelia felt the babies kick as if they could sense her distress. She was 5 months along now and her pregnancy was already showing more than expected with triplets. She's trying to paint herself as some kind of medical hero, Ethan said disgustedly. Using my family's tragedies to justify her crimes. There's more. David hesitated. The records show that your mother tried to take you away when you were a child. She claimed your father was abusive, that he was conducting unauthorized genetic experiments on terminal patients through a secret lab in the Blackwood mansion. The color drained from Ethan's face. The East Wing, he whispered. Father always kept it locked. Said it was because of Mother's episodes that she'd become obsessed with it. We need to search that wing, David said urgently. If there's any evidence of illegal experiments, the mansion burned down 10 years ago, Ethan interrupted. Right after my father's death, the East Wing was completely destroyed. Was it? Elizabeth's voice made them all turn. She stood in the doorway holding an old envelope. Or did your father fake that too, just like he faked my death? Mrs. Garcia appeared behind her, wringing her hands. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, she insisted. On coming up. The mansion didn't burn down, Elizabeth continued. Your father just made it look that way. The East Wing is still there, hidden behind false walls, and I can prove it. She held up the envelope. This isn't just your father's. Suicide note, it's a confession, with coordinates, security codes, everything. The room erupted in chaos. David was already on the phone with their investigators. Mrs. Garcia was trying to make everyone sit down and drink tea, but Amelia was watching Ethan, seeing the war of emotions on his face. We have to check, she said softly, taking his hand. If there's any chance Victoria is telling even a partial truth, the hearing starts in 45 minutes, David reminded them. Then we split up, Ethan decided. David, you and Mother go to the hearing. Stall as long as you can. Amelia and I will check the mansion. You can't miss the hearing, David protested. It'll look like I'm finally choosing truth over appearances, Ethan finished. He looked at Amelia. Are you sure you're up for this? She nodded, but as she stood up, a wave of dizziness hit her. Dr. Morrison's warnings about a high-risk pregnancy echoed in her mind. "I'm coming too," Mrs. Garcia announced firmly. "Someone needs to make sure both of you don't overdo it." The drive to the old Blackwood mansion took 30 minutes. The grounds were overgrown, the main house a looming shadow behind rusted gates. But as they followed Elizabeth's directions to the east wing, something seemed off about the supposed fire damage. "The burn patterns," Amelia said, her nursing training kicking in. "They're too uniform, too perfect." Ethan wheeled himself to the wall she was examining. "There should be a hidden panel here, according to the note." Mrs. Garcia found it first, a slight depression in the wood that, when pressed, revealed a keypad. Ethan's hands shook as he entered the code from his father's letter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protest, a section of the wall began to slide away. The hidden corridor was dark and dusty, but obviously untouched by fire. As they moved forward, motion sensors triggered dim lights. The air was stale, filled with the scent of old paper and abandonment. "Look at this," Amelia gasped, pointing to the walls. They were lined with filing cabinets, each labeled with dates going back decades. Ethan rolled to the nearest cabinet and pulled out a file at random. His face went pale as he read. "These are medical records," he said. "Experimental. Treatments. Genetic modifications." He pulled out more files. "Some of these patients were terminal with the same heart condition that runs in our family. Father was using them as test subjects." "Testing what?" Amelia asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "Ways to eliminate the genetic defect." Ethan's voice was hollow. He was trying to create a cure not just for the heart condition, but for all inherited diseases. And when the experiments failed, he couldn't finish the sentence. A noise from deeper in the corridor made them all freeze. It sounded like humming. "Someone's here," Mrs. Garcia whispered. They moved forward cautiously. The humming grew louder, and now they could make out words. "Rockabye baby, in the treetop." The corridor opened into a large room filled with medical equipment, and there, sitting in an antique rocking chair, was Victoria. "I knew you'd come," she said softly, not looking up from the old photograph she was holding. "When Elizabeth delivered that letter, I knew you'd have to know the truth." "How did you get out of jail?" Ethan demanded. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Money opens many doors, darling, and Thomas Reynolds has so much of it." She finally looked up at them. "Did you really think I'd let them lock me away before I could finish what your father started?" Amelia stepped forward, one hand protectively over her belly. "What are you talking about? The babies you're carrying aren't just random experiments," Victoria said, standing up. "They're the culmination of 30 years of research. Your father was brilliant, Ethan. He almost cracked the code to eliminating genetic diseases completely. And I finished his work." She walked to a nearby desk and picked up a thick file. "Those babies aren't just yours, Ethan. They carry genetic material from all the successful trials, from decades of research. They're perfect, enhanced, the next step in human evolution." "You're insane," Ethan whispered. "No," Victoria's voice hardened. "I'm visionary, just like your father. And now..." She pressed a button on the desk. Metal shutters slammed down over the entrance they'd come through. "Now you're going to help me complete the final phase of the experiment." The lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance they heard sirens, but they were trapped in the hidden wing of a mansion everyone thought had burned down years ago, with a woman who had finally shown her true madness. And Amelia, her hands pressed against her stomach, felt the first sharp pain of premature labor beginning. Amelia doubled over in pain, and Mrs. Garcia rushed to support her. "The babies were coming too early, way too early. Let them out," Ethan demanded, wheeling himself between Victoria and Amelia. "She needs a hospital." "Oh, she'll have the best medical care right here," Victoria said, pressing another button. Hidden panels in the walls slid open, revealing state-of-the-art medical equipment. This facility was designed for exactly this moment. "You planned this," Amelia gasped through another contraction. "You knew we'd come here today." Victoria smiled. "Elizabeth was so easy to manipulate. All I had to do was give her that letter, knowing she'd bring it to you. And now..." She pulled out a syringe. "Now we can complete the experiment properly." "Don't you dare come near her," Ethan growled, but Victoria just laughed. "You can't stop me, darling. Not in that wheelchair. And these babies, they're too important to medical science to be born in some ordinary hospital." Mrs. Garcia had been quiet, supporting Amelia. But now she stepped forward, her usually kind face hard with anger. "You forgot something, Mrs. Victoria," she said in her quiet way. "Before I worked for Mr. Ethan, I was a combat nurse in Desert Storm, and I never go anywhere without my phone." She held up her cell phone, showing the active call to emergency services. Through the speaker, they could hear sirens getting closer. Victoria's face twisted with rage. She lunged forward with the syringe, but Mrs. Garcia moved with surprising speed. In one smooth motion, she grabbed Victoria's arm and twisted, sending the syringe flying. Victoria screamed in fury and pain. "That's a military hold," Mrs. Garcia said calmly, keeping Victoria pinned. "I can keep her here all day." But they had bigger problems. Amelia's water had broken, and the contractions were getting stronger. "The babies!" she cried out. "It's too early!" Ethan wheeled to the medical equipment Victoria had revealed. "These monitors are working. Mrs. Garcia, can you—" "Already on it," the former combat nurse said, still holding Victoria with one hand while checking the equipment with the other. "This is actually better stuff than we had in the field hospital." Victoria laughed through her pain. "Of course it is. This lab cost millions to build and maintain. I've been funding it in secret for years, waiting for this moment." Suddenly, they heard banging from above. "Police, is anyone down there?" "Here," Ethan shouted. "We need medical help." The metal shutters groaned as someone worked to force them open. They could hear multiple voices now, including one that sounded like Elizabeth. "The emergency override," Victoria said bitterly. She must have remembered it from before. The shutters finally lifted, revealing a team of police officers, paramedics and Elizabeth Blackwood, who looked horrified at the hidden lab. "It's all still here," she whispered. "Exactly as it was when your father—" But there was no time for memories. The paramedics rushed to Amelia, who was now fully in labor. "We need to get her to a hospital," one of them said. "No," Victoria struggled against Mrs. Garcia's hold. "The babies have to be born here. The monitoring equipment, the tests we need to run. The only place these babies are being born is in a proper hospital," Ethan said firmly. He looked at the paramedics. "I'm their father. Whatever she's done to them genetically, they're our children and they deserve proper medical care." As they prepared to move Amelia, Victoria made one last, desperate move. She broke free from Mrs. Garcia and ran to a computer terminal. "If I can't have them," she screamed, "no one will. One press of this button and 30 years of research, all the formulas, everything about what makes these babies special, it all gets erased." "Go ahead," Ethan said quietly. Everyone stared at him. "What?" Victoria faltered. "Delete it all, because none of it matters. These aren't experiments, Victoria. They're our children. And whether they're genetically enhanced or not, whether they have my father's heart condition or not, we're going to love them and protect them." Amelia reached for his hand through her pain. "He's right," she gasped. "You can't control love with science, Victoria. You never could." Victoria's finger hovered over the delete button. Behind her, through the open shutters, they could see more police arriving, and someone who looked like David rushing down the corridor. "It was supposed to be me," Victoria whispered, and for the first time, they heard real pain in her voice. "I was supposed to give you children. I was supposed to fix everything that was wrong with your family's genes. Your father promised me—" "My father was wrong," Ethan said. "About everything. About experimenting on people, about locking up my mother, about thinking he could control nature itself, and you're wrong too." Another contraction hit Amelia hard. The paramedics were urgent now. They needed to move her immediately. Victoria looked at the computer screen, then at the approaching police, and finally at Ethan and Amelia. For a moment they saw something like clarity in her eyes. "The formulas," she said suddenly. "The genetic modifications. You need to know what was done for the baby's sake." Her finger moved away from the delete button. "Take it all." And she looked at Amelia. "I'm sorry, I think I lost myself somewhere along the way." The police reached her then, putting her in handcuffs as David burst in with a team of lawyers and medical experts. But Amelia and Ethan weren't paying attention anymore. The paramedics were moving her onto a stretcher, and Ethan was holding her hand so tight it almost hurt. "Stay with me," she whispered to him. "Always," he promised. "We're in this together." As they rushed toward the waiting ambulance, Elizabeth caught up with them. "Ethan, there's something else you need to know, something in your father's letter that I haven't told you yet." But her voice was drowned out by the sound of helicopter blades. A medical evacuation team was landing on the quay. Mansion's lawn. Whatever secrets still remained in the Blackwood, family history would have to wait. Right now, 3 tiny lives were about to enter the world, way ahead of schedule. And in the back of her mind, through the pain and fear, Amelia couldn't help but wonder, what else was Elizabeth holding back? What final revelation could be so important that it had made Victoria choose surrender over destruction? The helicopter lifted off into the gathering dusk, carrying precious cargo and even more precious secrets. Below in the hidden lab, David and his team began the process of documenting everything. Every file, every record, every piece of evidence that would finally bring the full truth of the Blackwood family legacy to light. The helicopter landed on the roof of Mount Sinai Hospital just as the sun was setting over Manhattan. Dr. Morrison was already waiting with a team of specialists. 28 weeks, she said, as they rushed Amelia into the delivery room. "It's early, but we've handled earlier. These babies are fighters. I can feel it." Ethan never let go of Amelia's hand as they transferred him from his wheelchair to a seat beside her. Mrs. Garcia had somehow beaten them to the hospital and was already in scrubs, ready to assist. "The baby's heart rates are strong," one of the nurses announced, checking the monitors. "But we need to move quickly." "Ethan," Elizabeth called from the doorway. They wouldn't let her into the delivery room, but her face was urgent. "You need to know about your father's letter." "Not now, Mother," Ethan snapped, focused entirely on Amelia. "But it's about the babies. Your father, he wasn't just experimenting on patients." "Hi." A nurse firmly guided her away from the door. Amelia's labor progressed rapidly. Too rapidly, according to the worried looks the doctors exchanged. "Here comes the first one," Dr. Morrison announced. "Push, Amelia." The room filled with the sound of a baby's cry. "It's a boy," the doctor announced. But there was no time to celebrate. The second baby was already coming. "Another boy," Dr. Morrison called out minutes later. Amelia was exhausted, but she had one more to go. She squeezed Ethan's hand. "Talk to me," she gasped. "Keep me here. You're the strongest person I've ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When this is all over, I'm going to marry you for real. Not because of scandal or babies or family legacy, but because I fall more in love with you every day." The third baby chose that moment to make his entrance, almost as if responding to his father's declaration of love. "It's another boy," Dr. Morrison announced. "Triplets, all boys, all breathing on their own." But something was wrong. The monitors started beeping erratically. "Her blood pressure's dropping," a nurse called out. "Amelia!" Ethan's voice was panicked. "Amelia, stay with me!" The room erupted in controlled chaos. As they rushed to stabilize Amelia, Elizabeth burst back in, waving a piece of paper. "The genetic modifications," she cried out. "They're not just in the babies. Victoria did something to Amelia too during the implantation. Something about ensuring compatibility." Dr. Morrison grabbed the paper, scanning it quickly. "Get me the red vial from Victoria's lab," she ordered. They brought it with the evidence. "Now!" Mrs. Garcia moved faster than anyone, returning seconds later with a small red vial. "This better work," Dr. Morrison muttered as she injected it into Amelia's IV. "Because if what this says is true..." The monitors slowly stabilized. Color returned to Amelia's cheeks. "What?" she whispered weakly. "What was that?" "The answer to why you were compatible with the babies at all," Elizabeth said softly. "Victoria didn't just modify the embryos. She modified you too, using genetic material from me." "What?" Ethan stared at his mother. "Your father's last confession," Elizabeth continued. "He didn't just experiment on patients. He experimented on our whole family. On me, on you. That's why you survived the heart condition that killed others. And Victoria, she found a way to pass that survival trait through Amelia to the babies. "Is that even possible?" Ethan demanded. "Apparently it is," Dr. Morrison said, checking Amelia's vitals. "And it just saved her life. The babies too, look. They all turned to where the 3 tiny boys lay in their incubators. Despite being premature, they were pink and healthy. Their heartbeats strong and steady." "They're perfect," Amelia whispered. "But how?" Ethan began. "I think," Dr. Morrison said slowly, "that we're looking at something unprecedented in medical history. Victoria may have been unethical, maybe even criminal, but what she accomplished. She found a way to not just prevent genetic defects, but to create a kind of biological harmony between mother and babies that shouldn't have been possible." "So Amelia really is their mother," Mrs. Garcia said. "Not just by love, but by blood, too." "By something even deeper than blood," Elizabeth replied. "By science we barely understand." Amelia wasn't listening anymore. She was focused on Ethan, who was looking at her with tears in his eyes. "I meant what I said," he whispered, "about marrying you for real." "I know," she smiled weakly. "I've known for a while now." The babies chose that moment to cry in perfect unison, as if announcing their agreement with their parents' plans. But in the corridor outside, David was having an intense conversation on his phone, and the words he was hearing would bring one final twist to the Blackwood family saga. Because Victoria might have been arrested, but Thomas Reynolds was still free, and he had plans for these miracle babies, plans that would put everything their parents had fought for at risk. In her hospital bed, still weak but recovering, Amelia held her 3 tiny sons while Ethan watched in wonder. They didn't know it yet, but their greatest battle was still to come, and it would begin with a single phone call that would reach the hospital room just as they were choosing names for their miracle triplets. A call that would reveal the darkest secret of all, the real reason Thomas Reynolds had helped Victoria all along. The triplets were 3 days old when the call came. Amelia was resting in her private hospital room, the babies sleeping nearby in their incubators. Ethan had just wheeled in with coffee when his phone rang. "Mr. Blackwood?" Thomas Reynolds' smooth voice filled the room through the speaker. "I believe it's time we had a chat about those remarkable children of yours." "What do you want, Reynolds?" Ethan demanded. "Want? I want what's mine. You see, your father didn't just experiment on your family. He experimented on mine too. My mother was one of his first test subjects. She died in his secret lab, but not before he extracted genetic material that he later used in his research. The same research Victoria used to create your sons." Amelia sat up straighter in her bed, her protective instincts flaring. "Those babies carry my family's DNA too," Reynolds continued. "And I've just filed a legal claim for shared custody." The coffee cup slipped from Ethan's hand, shattering on the floor. Mrs. Garcia, who had been arranging flowers by the window, rushed to clean it up. "You're insane," Ethan said. "No court would ever." "No? With Victoria ready to testify about how your father stole genetic material from dying patients? About how those babies were created using stolen DNA from multiple families? I think you'll find the courts very interested indeed." The line went dead. Almost immediately, David burst into the room. "Reynolds just filed the paperwork," he said grimly. "And he's not alone. 5 other families have come forward, all claiming their relatives were victims of your father's experiments, all demanding rights to the babies." "No," Amelia said firmly, standing up despite her weakness. "These are our children. I don't care what DNA they carry. I carried them. I gave birth to them. I love them. And I think," came Elizabeth's voice from the doorway, "I have the proof to end this once and for all." She walked in carrying an old leather briefcase. "Your father didn't just leave a confession letter. He left evidence, documentation of every experiment, every test subject, every family member involved, including consent forms." "Consent forms?" Ethan asked. "Yes. It seems Thomas Reynolds' mother wasn't a victim at all. She was a willing participant. She and Thomas's father both signed extensive waivers. They were paid very well for their participation." "But why would they?" Amelia began. "Because they were desperate," Elizabeth explained. "The Reynolds family was poor then, before Thomas built his empire. They needed money for his education. They sold their genetic material, knowing exactly what it would be used for. David was already reaching for the briefcase. If we can prove Reynolds knew about this all along. We can, came another voice. Victoria stood in the doorway, flanked by police officers. She looked different, smaller somehow, without her usual perfect appearance. I'm here to make a full confession, she said quietly. About everything, including Thomas Reynolds' involvement from the very beginning. One of the babies, little Matthew, the firstborn, began to cry. Amelia went to him automatically, lifting him with a mother's gentle touch. Reynolds approached me years ago, Victoria continued, watching Amelia with the baby. He knew about the experiments because he'd found his parents' papers after they died. He wanted to use the research to create designer babies, perfect children for wealthy parents. When I refused, he threatened to expose everything. That's when I lost myself, started believing I could play God. She stepped closer to the incubator, holding the other two babies, Mark and Michael. They're beautiful, she whispered. And they're yours. Completely, totally yours. Whatever genetic material went into their creation, love is what makes a family. I understand that now. Ethan wheeled closer to Amelia and Matthew. So it's over? Almost, David said, already scanning the documents from Elizabeth's briefcase. With Victoria's testimony in these papers, Reynolds doesn't have a leg to stand on. Neither do any of the other families. Look, they all signed waivers. They were all paid participants. But the genetic modifications, Dr. Morrison said from where she'd been quietly observing. The medical implications will remain private, Elizabeth said firmly. These babies deserve to grow up normal, loved, not studied like lab experiments. Amelia looked down at Matthew, then at Mark and Michael in their incubators. They were growing stronger every day, defying all odds. They'll never be completely normal, she said softly. They'll always be extraordinary, but not because of genetics or experiments, because they're loved, because they brought all of us together, helped us find truth, and taught us what really matters. Ethan took her free hand, squeezing it gently. Marry me, he said again. Not for show this time, not for the press or the scandal or anything else. Marry me because we found love in the middle of chaos. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Reynolds' case fell apart as soon as Victoria testified. The other families withdrew their claims when faced with the evidence of their own participation in the experiments. And the press, which had been so hungry for scandal, found themselves reporting on a different story, a story of love, redemption, and the true meaning of family. 1 month after the triplets were born, strong enough now to leave the hospital, Amelia and Ethan got married in a small ceremony in the hospital chapel. Mrs. Garcia was matron of honor. The babies were ring bearers in tiny tuxedos, wheeled down the aisle in their stroller by a tearful Elizabeth. Victoria watched the ceremony on TV from her prison cell, where she was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation. She smiled sadly, finally at peace with the knowledge that her quest for perfection had led to something perfect after all, just not in the way she'd planned. The Blackwood Mansion's secret lab was converted into a research center for ethical genetic studies, with all proceeds going to help families affected by genetic diseases. Elizabeth headed the foundation, finding purpose in helping others while rebuilding her relationship with her son. And in the penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Amelia stood by the nursery window, watching the sunrise while her 3 miracle babies slept. Ethan wheeled up beside her, pulling her onto his lap. Any regrets? He asked softly. She looked at their reflection in the window, her in her nursing scrubs. She'd insisted on going back to work part-time. Him in his wheelchair that no longer seemed like a limitation, just a part of who he was. Behind them, 3 identical cribs held 3 perfect boys who were somehow both miracles of science and simple, beloved babies. Not a single one, she said, turning to kiss him. Every crazy moment led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be. In their cribs, the triplets slept on, their tiny hearts beating in perfect sync. They would grow up knowing they were loved, knowing that family isn't made in a lab, but in the heart. and somewhere in their unique genetic code was written not just a medical miracle, but a love story that defied all odds. The sun rose fully over Manhattan, painting the nursery in shades of gold. Another day was beginning for the Blackwood family, not the one that had been planned in a secret lab or engineered in a test tube, but the one that had been built with love, trust, and the kind of miracle that no science could ever fully explain, and that was the greatest experiment of all.